Well, good day, everybody. Yeah, we're here in the month of March, which is International Women's Month, and we're going to talk about a famous woman, very important in American history. And this woman had, as you'll see, done a lot to give a voice to American women. Remember, it was a point where they couldn't vote, they had no rights. It was the same as a person of color. So they had to struggle and do their own fight to get their rights. Let's see what we're talking about. When people think of the rights of women, of the protection of those rights, and of those who fought most vigorously to secure those rights, well, few names come to mind. Well, few names come to mind swifter, in the United States at least, than that of the passionate woman suffrage leader, Susan B. Anthony. And I'm sure you've heard her name before. And if you haven't, it's a name you should remember. Susan B. Anthony. Well, Susan B. Anthony holds a special place of honor in the history of equality for her unflinching devotion to the cause, her unwavering leadership, and her determination to see women receive the vote. Susan, so who was she? And what led her down the path of righteousness? Well, Susan Browell Anthony was born on February 15th, 1820, to a family of reformers. Reformers were very religious people, and there were many groups. Among the most known were Quakers. Anyway, some of her brothers would later fight against pro-slavery forces in Kansas in order to ensure that when Kansas joined the Union on the 29th of January, 1861, it would do so as a free state. Although they were Quakers by religion, they did not hold with many traditional Quaker thoughts. They were kind of outside of the main Quaker religion traditions. Their family was considered too liberal at the time, and a rift grew between them and the rest of the congregation after Susan's father, Daniel Anthony, allowed a dance to occur at his home. Imagine that. That was such a scandal, just allowing a dance to occur at his home, that the rest of the religious community, the Quakers, wanted to disassociate themselves. So in 1837, the economic panic struck, and the country and the Anthonys lost most of their material wealth. You've heard of depressions and recessions. Well, they had a bad one back in 1837. The most famous we heard of was the one in 1929. Although an uncle bought their belongings at an auction and returned the items to the family, they were still desperately short of money. And so Susan decided to go to work as a teacher at the Quaker school. Times were hard. The Anthonys continued to be at the fringes of society due to their passionate reforming nature, and their farm became a place where other like-minded individuals who sought reformation came, including the great Frederick Douglass, who was a well-known abolitionist in Rochester, New York. As Susan B. Anthony grew older, she taught herself a range of social reform concepts and worked tirelessly to improve both her knowledge of the subject and her eloquence when it came to delivering her message. For a brief time, she was even a strong proponent of wearing the highly controversial blooming dress. If you look at the picture, you'll see what I mean, which did not go all the way down to the ankles. Although the dress was far more comfortable and easier for women to wear, she was eventually forced to stop wearing the improved garment so that opponents would be compelled to address her ideas instead of mercilessly criticizing her clothing. In 1851 at Seneca Falls, Susan B. Anthony met another strong and motivated woman called Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had previously written the Declaration of Sentiments, which, being based upon the United States Declaration of Independence, made the proclamation that men and women were created equal and that women should be allowed to vote. Women were not considered equal, and they could not vote. They had no say. And that's what women's suffrage was all about, trying to get the rights for women. The meeting between the pair was fortuitous, as Elizabeth and Susan had mutually beneficial skills, with Elizabeth being an outstanding writer and Susan being a highly effective organizer and strategist. The pair worked well together, and their friendship grew as they continued to work hard in the women's suffrage movement. The rights of women in the early and mid-19th century, that's the 1800s, guys, were few and limited. As we said, they couldn't vote, they had no voice in the government, and they were just second-class people, like the slaves. Women did not traditionally work in roles outside of the household, and so had little to say in society. Added to this, any woman who was successful and generated an income would be compelled by force of law to hand any money over to their spouse. They couldn't keep their own pay. They had to give it to their husbands. Imagine that. This meant that even a financially capable and successful woman, if she were married, would not have any say in her own financial solvency. Additionally, women were not generally allowed to own any property, and as they could not vote, they could do nothing to alter the situation either. That's it. They had no say. Between the lack of economic options and the lack of voting power, the rights of women were severely curtailed. However, the women's reform movement did not grow up in a vacuum, and many of the movers and shakers of the women's rights movement first got their feet wet in the greatest political social reform of the 19th century, the combat of slavery. So women were behind the abolitionists. They wanted to do away with slavery. And that fight gave them practice on how to ask for their own rights. Many of them did not even feel the issues were all that different from each other, as both sought to ensure that certain classes of people received the rights that had been up to until that point denied to them. The women's rights movement, with Susan B. Anthony leading the charge, managed to have a brief success in the 1860s when the New York legislature passed a bill allowing women greater rights for owning separate property. Throughout the 1850s and 1860s, Susan B. Anthony lectured regularly and held meetings throughout the whole state of New York. However, as the 1860s progressed, the women's rights movement slowed down significantly, in no small part due to the start of the American Civil War. Although Susan was a capable rising star in the women's movement, as it sought to coalesce into a single national front instead of a series of smaller divided sub-efforts, she was hesitant at first to take on greater responsibility, as she was also working long hours hosting anti-slavery meetings. Susan and many others in the women's rights movement were very active within a small number of different reform campaigns, including the Underground Railroad, which brought escaped slaves from the South to freedom in the North. Anti-slavery work throughout the North, the temperance movement, and the women's rights movement. Although work on women's rights legislation had stalled due to the Civil War, as the decade went on, Susan B. Anthony's political charisma, her fame, and the movement as a whole began to shift, and throughout the late 1860s and through 1870s, women's suffrage became a topic of serious national political discussion. A country that had just fought to secure the rights of African Americans was now deciding morally about giving rights to other disenfranchised groups as well. Women first received the right to vote in the state of Wyoming in 1869, and Susan B. Anthony was invited to address that legislators in other states who are considering similar moves. Although the women's rights movement faced several serious setbacks, which included women being denied the right to vote by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1875, the movement pressed on, deciding to go down the far more difficult route of seeking to secure rights through the ballot box with a constitutional amendment instead of through the judiciary. As you see from all these photos that we're looking at, which captured the moments in those days, it was a struggle. Think about it. A woman could not vote. A woman could not voice her opinion politically. A woman could not own property. And if she was married, any money that she made belonged to her husband. Well, the fight went on for decades, but slowly, through the tireless work of Susan B. Anthony and tens of thousands of others, the political mindset of the country changed. And on August 18th, 1920, the United States Constitution received the 19th Amendment and so gave women the constitutional right to vote. That was a big deal. Women could not vote until 1920. Well, although that was to be her legacy, Susan B. Anthony herself never lived to see it, as she died at her house in Rochester, New York on the 13th of March in 1906. That was her home. Although she never would see the full vote being given to women, she was proud of the movement that she had been a part of and all that they had achieved to secure not only the rights for women, but the rights for all peoples. Well, guys, that's Susan B. Anthony. I hope you appreciated this knowledge. You know, a lot of famous women in the world, and they deserve the credit, just like a lot of famous people. So this month is dedicated to the women. Thank you, Susan B. Anthony.